They'll tell you I fired on a friendly vessel. That's the part of the record that never got expunged. The part that follows me from port to port like a bad smell, that gets whispered in docking bays and scratched into bathroom walls on a dozen stations from here to the outer rim. Saber Rain, the man who shot his own squadron. They'll leave out the part where she was innocent. They always leave that part out. Her name was Crotalus, and she was the best intelligence asset the Star Force had run in 40 years of the Saurian conflict. She fed us convoy routes, weapon depot coordinates, command frequencies. She gave us the location of the Velthari processing facility on Morin IV, the one that was converting civilians for labor. We went in, pulled 300 people out of that facility, and got home without losing a single trooper. That was Crotalus. That was what she was worth to us, and what she cost us was exactly nothing, because an informant who wants to survive and sees you as her best option is an informant who doesn't need bribing. When the armistice came, Command decided she was a liability. Political settlement required that both sides produce evidence of good faith, which in practice meant handing over certain assets whose continued existence was an embarrassment to the treaty. Crotalus had given us data that technically constituted a violation of the Saurian sovereignty protocols that the negotiating teams were pretending had been in place all along. The order came down through back channels, not official channels, which was itself instructive, and what it said was that Squadron X was to engage and destroy a Saurian vessel in the Crotalus corridor on what the orders called a final sweep. No briefing, no tribunal, no hearing where someone might ask inconvenient questions, just a kill order wrapped in the bureaucratic language of procedure. I put my ship between them and her. I disabled Taylor's shields with a single precision burst so he'd have to peel off and couldn't follow through, and I spent the next 6 hours on the comm arguing with a rear admiral who had never once been close enough to the front to smell burning hull metal or watch a source walk into a hostile compound, knowing that if she was made, the only help coming was whatever we had in range. The admiral talked about duty and chain of command and the necessities of political reality. I talked about what Crotalus had earned. We didn't reach an agreement. They stripped my rank, gave me a dishonorable discharge and a bill for the damage to Taylor's ship. Crotalus got away clean into outer rim space where nobody was going to follow. I told myself that was enough, that it had to be enough, that the cost was the cost and the arithmetic worked out, and that a person who does the right thing shouldn't need a prize for it. That's what I told myself. Some days I believed it. That was 8 years before a man named Voss walked into a cantina on Pellamere Station and sat down across from me without being invited. He was a commander, current service, in a uniform that was too clean and too pressed for a man who traveled any real distance to get here. He had the look of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without the messiness of debate, not arrogant about it, just calibrated to a certain kind of response from the world. 2 soldiers at the bar were trying to look casual and failing at it. His backup. I kept eating. "You're Saber Rain," he said. I'm a man trying to finish his meal. He put a data chip on the table. I didn't pick it up. "There's a briefing on that chip," he said. "I'll summarize it for you. 2 weeks ago, Prince Tyr and his sister were taken from the Velthari Protectorate. We've tracked the extraction to a world called Durath, quarantine zone, outer rim, coordinates on the chip. No Star Force vessel has been cleared to enter the quarantine corridor without a diplomatic designation, which is why I'm here talking to you instead of mounting a standard extraction. A diplomatic insertion doesn't generate the kind of records that explain why a military team went in after 2 royals and came back with whatever else might be on that planet." I looked at him for the first time. He was serious. Whatever else he wasn't performing this. He believed the brief, he believed the mission, and he had the particular focus of someone who had been working the problem long enough that the worrying was behind him and only the solving remained. "You need a guide," I said. We need someone who knows how to operate in uncharted space without leaving a political wake. We need someone who knows Durath, or can learn it fast enough to keep 3 soldiers alive long enough to recover 2 prisoners. You could hire anyone for that. We hired you, he said. We looked at your record. The part about firing on a friendly vessel. The part before that. 17 successful extractions, 14 penetrations of fortified positions, 0 civilian casualties in 8 years of combat operations. He paused just long enough for the weight of it to land. And the part about firing on a friendly vessel. We want someone who makes that kind of call when he has to. I picked up the chip. His 2 soldiers were waiting at the docking ring when I arrived the next morning. The first was a woman named Fade, compact, watchful, with the kind of quiet that comes from confidence rather than shyness. She had a modification rig built into her left forearm that I recognized as custom black market work, expensive and meticulously maintained. Sensor integration, some kind of processing overlay. Someone had taught her well, or she'd taught herself, which in my experience produces better results anyway. The second soldier was a man called Rill, taller, with the easy patience of someone who had learned, through some combination of experience and temperament, to be still in the places where other people made noise. He carried a pulse rifle like it was an extension of his body, which it probably was. The rifle wasn't new. Neither was the hand that held it. You're the guide, Fade said, not a question. I'm the guide, I said. She studied me with the same flat attention she'd probably give to a piece of terrain before crossing it, not hostile, just comprehensive. We've read your file. Then you know more about me than I'd prefer. That goes for both of us, she said, and something in the delivery suggested she meant it about herself as well as me, which told me more than the rest of the exchange. Rill said nothing and nodded slightly. I came to understand that this was his version of a comprehensive greeting, and that the nod scaled upward with his approval of a person or situation. That first nod was minimal, but it was there. There was a 4th member of the team, already aboard my ship when we crossed the docking ring, a woman named Kendra Sin, who had the look of someone who had been in more fights than she could accurately count, and had come out the better side of all of them. She was older than the others by a decade at least, with a stillness to her that went deeper than Rill's patience and had more history in it. I found out later she'd been a combat instructor for the Star Force before retiring into something she described only as consulting, which in my experience is what people call the work they do when they've decided not to explain it to strangers. She was sitting in the navigator's chair like she'd been sitting in it all her life, and she looked at me when I entered my own cockpit with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite assessment, but lived in the territory between them. Commander Voss briefed me separately, she said. On what? On you. She turned back to the console, which she had already made herself comfortable with in a way that would have annoyed me about someone I liked less. He thought I'd have objections. Do you? I'll let you know. I thought about that for a moment and then let it go. There are people you waste time arguing with and people you don't, and Kendra Sin had the look of someone who would deliver her verdict when she was ready and not a moment before, and would not be moved by anything that happened in between. Voss came aboard 20 minutes before departure, settled into the aft compartment, and spent the transit to the jump corridor reviewing files on a data pad with the methodical focus of a man who was either very organized or very worried. I suspected both. He was the kind of officer who would go into a situation knowing everything he could know and still be aware that knowledge has flaws, and the unknown is where things go wrong. That awareness, in my experience, makes the good ones and destroys the ones who can't live with uncertainty. I didn't know yet which kind he was. We made the jump without incident. Space between jumps has its own specific silence, the kind that exists because there's truly nothing outside the hull for distances that the mind isn't built to process. You get used to it or you don't. Rill slept through it. Fade ran maintenance diagnostics on the sensor rig twice, which was once more than necessary, and told me something about her relationship with being still. Durath came up on the long-range scanner 12 hours after we dropped out of jump, and even the scanner image was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Most quarantine worlds have the look of abandonment, craters, stripped landscapes, the gray quiet of places that have been left alone long enough to forget they were ever inhabited. Durath had atmosphere and vegetation and substantial cloud cover, but the orbital profile was strange. Too uniform. Too even. The albedo readings were inconsistent in a way that didn't match natural variation. Like whatever lived there had been tending to it in some deliberate fashion, or like the planet itself was being managed by something that understood its own biochemistry. "I'm reading surface structures," Rill said from the sensor station. "Ancient ruins," I told him. "The Quarantine Authority survey listed them when they sealed the zone. Pre-compact civilization, may be older. The survey team didn't have time or authorization for detailed analysis. Nobody's studied them because nobody's been allowed in long enough to study anything." "And now somebody's in," Fade said, looking at the secondary display where I could see the heat signature of a grounded vessel on the southern continent. It was not a small ship. Whatever it was, it had been there long enough that the landing site's vegetation had adapted around it. "Ingen," Voss said from the hatchway behind us. He'd come forward without any of us hearing him, which was either impressive or a comment on our attentiveness. His people pulled him out of cryo-storage 8 months ago. He was sealed in somewhere on this planet, ancient detention, built by the same civilization that built the ruins. He was put there by his own allies and left to freeze while the politics resolved around him. Whoever freed him, he's been active since, building a base in the ruins. "Recruiting." "Recruiting what?" Kendra asked from the navigator's chair without turning around. Voss looked at the scanner image for a moment before answering, and the pause was not dramatic hesitation. It was a man choosing the right words for something that didn't have comfortable words. "The Quintari," he said. That landed in the cockpit like a stone dropped in deep water. Fade and Rill exchanged a look. Kendra's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted, a recalibration. "I'd heard of the Quintari the way you hear about diseases, from people who had survived contact with them and spent the rest of their lives trying to explain what they'd encountered to people who couldn't quite grasp it. They were insectoid in structure, roughly humanoid in proportions, but the comparison ended there, and the rest was its own territory. Their neurological architecture was collective, not in the metaphorical sense that armies act collectively, but in the literal sense that individual Quintari shared a chemical signaling network that functioned as a distributed nervous system across an entire colony. They didn't experience individual fear. They didn't experience individual loss. You could kill half of them and the remaining half would continue the assault with no degradation in coordination, no hesitation, no grief, because the loss registered to the colony the way losing a few cells registers to a body, felt, processed, and metabolized without any of it stopping the movement. The only known way to truly stop a Quintari assault was to identify and destroy the colony's primary signaling node, a biological structure carried in the body of the oldest breeding female in any given group. Without the node broadcasting the colony's coordination signal, individual Quintari devolved into simple territorial aggression, which was still dangerous, but was at least something a trained soldier could approach with conventional tactics. With the node active, you were fighting something that had no experience of its own mortality, and the strategies built around exploiting an enemy's instinct for self-preservation were useless. "How many?" I asked. "Unknown," Voss said. "The scout data was incomplete, at least 100 confirmed on surface, possibly significantly more. 5 of us I did not say aloud, but everyone in the cockpit was doing the same arithmetic, and nobody looked good at the end of it. We set down in a river valley 10 kilometers north of the ruins complex. under the canopy of a forest that smelled of copper and wet stone, and something else, something organic and deliberate that I couldn't name and didn't like. The light through the canopy was the color of old bruises, filtering through a leaf structure that was wrong in the same way the planet's orbital profile was wrong, uniform in a way that natural variation doesn't produce, like a forest that had been shaped rather than grown. Whatever Durath's star was putting out, the canopy above us was optimized to receive it. Kendra was on her feet before the ramp finished lowering, rifle already up, moving through a sweep pattern without being told. Rill matched her on the opposite side, taking a different sector without any signal between them. They'd worked together before. I could see it in how they moved, how they didn't need to communicate the areas they were covering, because they'd already mapped that division out of habit. Fade dropped to a knee at the ramp's edge and pulled something from her pack that turned out to be a compact sensor array, which she assembled with the focused speed of a person who had done this in total darkness and trusted the muscle memory. She had it active before I'd finished checking my own kit. Surface motion northwest, she said. Small, not bipedal. Wildlife, Rill said. Maybe. She watched the display for 3 seconds, moving too deliberately for most wildlife, staying at a fixed distance from the ship. Quintari scout, Kendra said. Or curiosity, I said. Neither of them disagreed, which meant neither of them thought I was right. We moved out in a wedge formation with Voss at the center rear, his choice, not mine, and I left it alone. He was a commander, not a field operator, and he knew it. He navigated his own limitations without requiring anyone to manage him around them, which in my experience is rarer in officers than it should be and worth more than most of the things they do teach at command school. The first hour was hard going through root systems that came up to knee height and ground cover that grabbed at boots with something close to intention. The copper smell got heavier as we moved south. I tracked the ruins complex on my handheld as we walked structures that the Quarantine Authority survey had described as ceremonial, which in my experience is what survey teams write when they mean, we have no idea what these actually were, and we're not being paid enough to find out. We heard the first Quintari before we saw it. To call it a sound is not quite accurate. It was a pressure change, a shift in the air that registered at the outermost edge of hearing, more felt than heard, the way you feel a large engine running through a deck plate before you hear it with your ears. A note below the threshold of clear perception. Fade put her fist up and we stopped moving. Kendra was already turned in the direction of the pressure change, rifle at her shoulder, weight forward. I'd been told that Quintari gave off a pheromone signal that humans could detect subconsciously, that it produced a generalized anxiety response that soldiers often mistook for their own fear until they understood what they were actually perceiving. Knowing that intellectually and feeling it in your chest for the first time are not the same thing. My hands were steady. My heart rate wasn't. Came through the canopy from above, not dropping but flowing, the way liquid moves down a slope with no urgency because gravity is reliable. 6 limbs, the upper 2 held slightly away from the body in what might have been a threat display or might have been a signal to something we couldn't see. The compound eyes caught no light and gave nothing back. The mandibles were not moving. It regarded us, or rather, the colony regarded us through it with an attention that had no aggression in it yet. Pure assessment. We were data. Rill shot it. The first round hit center mass, and the Quintari staggered. The second dropped it. It was still twitching when 4 more came through the canopy from 3 different directions simultaneously, which meant the first one's registration of us had already been processed and distributed before Rill fired, and the response was already in motion before the threat even registered as a threat. The subauditory pressure rose. Not threatening, just present, the way pressure changes before a storm. Move, I said. We moved. Running under that canopy with Quintari above and to both flanks was not a firefight in any sense I recognized from my service years. It was more like being tracked by a river, something that flowed around obstacles and maintained its shape regardless of what you threw at it. Rill and Kandra were methodical and effective, covering each other's angles, dropping one every dozen meters, and it mattered about as much as pulling out a single stone matters to the current. They kept coming. They maintained the same relative spacing. They didn't hurry and they didn't slow down, and none of the ones in the rear stopped when the ones in front went down. There was no reaction to the losses because there was no individual there to react. "They're hurting us," Fade said, not out of breath, watching her scanner display as she ran with the rig mounted on her forearm. "Southeast, toward the ruins." "Then we go southeast," I said. "Rain. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. They have numbers, they have the high ground, they have a forest they know and we don't. They haven't committed to a kill. Whatever they want from us, it's in the ruins." I glanced at Voss. He met my eyes and nodded, a tactical concession, not agreement. There's a difference and he knew it. The ruins came up out of the ground the way mountains do, gradually, and then all at once. What the survey had called ceremonial structures turned out to be the uppermost fraction of a complex that extended deep underground, the surface portion worn down to its foundations by whatever centuries of weather Durath ran through its cycles, but the subsurface intact and lit with a sourceless amber light. The light came from strips embedded in the corridor walls at regular intervals, neither warm nor cold, functional and unwavering. Old technology, very old, and still running after what must have been thousands of years of abandonment. The power source for it was still active and undiminished, which was the first clear sign that whoever built this place had operated at a technical level the compact survey teams had not been prepared to assess and had not wanted to document. The Quintari stopped at the ruin's edge. Not one or two hanging back, all of them, the entire escort, pulling up at an invisible line defined not by walls or barriers, but by something in the pheromone network that said here and no further. They watched us descend into the amber light without following. Whatever was down here, they were keeping it contained rather than chasing us into it, and I was not sure which interpretation of that restraint was more concerning. The first sign that something was actively operating in the ruins was the smell, not the copper and stone of the surface forest, but something chemical and purposeful, the smell of a facility that was running active processes and managing their byproducts. Then the corridor lighting became brighter and more regular, suggesting a power draw in the deeper sections. Then we heard voices. Human voices. Voss heard it first, or at least he reacted first, going still in the corridor with a quality of stillness that was different from tactical discipline. Something more personal had surfaced. "Tyr," he said quietly, and the word had a shape to it that suggested this mission was not purely professional for him. "Prince," Rill confirmed, orienting toward the source. We moved more carefully after that, working the corridor in a loose stack with Kandra on point, and what we moved into was a chamber that had been many things before it became what it was now. Round, 40 meters across at least, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness far enough above that the amber strips on the lower walls couldn't reach it. Every surface was covered in the inscribed patterns that ran throughout this complex, geometric and organic at once, repeating in ways that suggested either mathematics or language or both, patterns that no one had decoded because no one had been here long enough to try. The chamber had been converted, not elegantly but thoroughly. Generators, communication arrays, processing units, atmospheric regulators, the kind of technical assembly that represents months of work and serious financial investment by someone who knew what they needed and had the resources to acquire it. Someone had been setting up shop here for a long time, long before the prince and princess were taken. This was not improvised. This was the goal. The prince was alive, sitting against the far wall with the resigned composure of someone who had been a prisoner long enough to move past fear and arrive at boredom. He was young, early 20s by my estimate, and he had the particular look of someone who had grown up expecting a certain kind of life and was currently having a very different one, and was handling it with more dignity than was strictly required of him. He looked up when we came in and some of the boredom fell away. In its place was something more complicated. Relief, yes, but also a caution that suggested he'd been thinking about this moment and had questions about what it meant. The princess was not there. "Where's your sister?" Voss said, and the urgency in his voice was not administrative. Tyr looked at him for a moment, a full, measuring moment before answering. "She's with St. John." "By force." A pause that lasted about 2 seconds longer than it needed to. "She went with him," Tyr said. "Once he explained what he'd found here, once he showed her the records." Fade and I looked at each other. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, because some information is best processed before it's spoken. We found St. John in the deepest chamber, where the amber light was brightest and the inscriptions densest, where the walls curved inward at the base like the interior of a biological structure rather than a constructed one. The design language down here was different from the upper corridors, less geometric, more curved, with an organic quality that suggested the builders had been thinking about something other than engineering when they made this space. He was standing at a console that seemed incongruously new for the room, though new was relative. Even his equipment had an antique quality, built to specifications that predated the current compact standard by at least a generation. He'd brought it in from storage, most likely. His own storage from before his imprisonment. A man who'd been sealed in a cryo chamber for 5 centuries and had still thought to pack carefully. He was not physically imposing, which was the first surprise. Average height lean, with the preserved look of someone whose body had spent centuries in cold suspension without aging, and had come out the other side as it had gone in, unremarkable at first glance. It was his presence that was wrong in the way that some things are wrong before you can name why. The way he held the space around him. The way the room's geometry seemed to orient toward him, as if the chamber had been built for this specific moment of occupancy. He had the stillness of someone who had been very patient for a very long time, and was no longer in a hurry about anything. Calliope was beside him. I had seen the profile image on Voss's data pad during the transit. The princess, early 20s, reported taken against her will, recovery a priority. What I saw now was not against her will. She stood half a step behind and to his left, which is a very specific position in the geometry of rooms like this, and her posture had the set quality of someone who had made a choice and had been living inside it long enough that the edges had smoothed. She was not a prisoner. She had not been for some time. St. John looked at us with the patience of a man who had been expecting this exact moment, and had decided long ago how he was going to handle it. "Saber Rain," he said, my name, which he had no business knowing, in a tone that suggested he'd known it for months. "I've been curious about you." "You've been busy," I said. "For 8 months, yes. Before that I was occupied with being frozen." His voice was flat and precise, the instrument of someone who had learned to communicate as a tool rather than a form of expression, stripped of the texture that comes from needing other people's approval. In the 5 centuries before my imprisonment, I was busy with other things. I find I'm behind on current events but not on history. He looked past me at the group. "Commander Voss. The prince told me you'd be sent for him." "He's coming with us," Voss said. "He always was." I had no use for him. He was leverage for the transport, nothing more. Once we were on planet, he became a guest. St. John glanced at Calliope without moving his head, a brief acknowledgement rather than a look. She came of her own accord, once she understood the scope of what I'm building here. "What are you building?" Kendra asked. He told us. He told us in the measured, organized way of someone who had been rehearsing the explanation for a long time, and had decided the truth was his best asset. It took 15 minutes and the chamber was quiet throughout, and by the end of it the quiet had a different quality than it had at the beginning. The short version was this. The Compact's quarantine of Durath was not about protecting the galaxy from whatever lived on the planet. It was about hiding what the Compact's founders had done here 5 centuries ago. The original civilization that built these ruins had developed a resonance weapon, a device that could attune itself to a biological system's unique chemical signature and disrupt it at the molecular level. Used against a single target, it was an assassination tool. Scaled up, using multiple emission points and a distributed resonance calibration, it was something else. Something that could be tuned to a specific genetic profile and would then affect every carrier of that profile within range, and only those carriers. The Compact's founders had used it on an enemy civilization that was challenging them for control of the inner rim trade routes. Not a surgical strike, a broad deployment calibrated to the population-level chemistry of an entire people. They had not killed all of them. The weapon was not perfect. The calibration was not clean, and some survived. The Quintari were what was left. The survivors of a population subjected to a resonance pulse that had restructured their neurological architecture across 3 generations of inheritance. Their collective consciousness was not an evolutionary adaptation. It was a wound, 3 generations old, still healing in the only direction it could. They've been contained in this quarantine zone with the evidence of what was done to them, St. said. The Compact calls them dangerous and feral. What they are is the surviving remnant of a civilization, shaped by a weapon the founders built from stolen technology and then buried on this planet along with the people it had already broken. He looked at Voss with the patience of someone making a statement rather than an argument. Which is why the Compact wants no one to examine them or this planet too closely. I watched Voss's face during this. He knew, not everything but the shape of it. He had known before we came down here, and he had come anyway, and he was listening now with the attention of someone deciding what to do with a weight they had been carrying. The energy source, Fade said. She was looking at the console, her modified forearm angled toward it, scanning. The powerful new energy source the briefing mentioned. The resonance weapon, St. said. Yes, still functional. The founders built it to last. I've spent 8 months learning its calibration system, and Calliope has been kind enough to provide the biological profiles I needed. Profiles of what? I said. His eyes moved to me with the slow attention of someone about to say something they have been looking forward to saying. Of the descendants, he said, the founding houses, the families that imprisoned me after I became inconvenient to them. I know their genetics. I know their chemical signatures. I can tune the resonance to every one of them and leave everyone else unaffected. He paused for exactly as long as the pause needed to be. I don't particularly care about the Quintari's rehabilitation. Their story is useful for establishing the weapon's history and the Compact's culpability. What I care about is settling debts that have been accruing interest for 5 centuries. The chamber was quiet. How many people? I asked. In the founding houses specifically, 40,000 perhaps. Their genetic lineage is well documented. They made sure of that for inheritance law purposes. Convenient. And the inhabited worlds where those 40,000 people live would be unaffected, he said. The resonance is precise. That's the point of it. I thought about 40,000 dead distributed across a dozen inhabited worlds. I thought about what 40,000 sudden deaths looks like to the billions living alongside them. I thought about the political architecture of the Compact, which was old and calcified and held together by the credibility of the founding houses, and by everyone else's understanding that the founding houses would continue to exist tomorrow as they had existed yesterday. I thought about the factions that had been waiting, with the patience of people who think in decades, for a crack in that architecture. You'd kill more than 40,000, I said. Maybe more than 40 million before the dust settled. That's speculation. That's history, I said. That's what happens when you remove a load-bearing wall from a structure that large and leave the rest standing. It falls onto people. He looked at me with something that might have been respect and might have been mild surprise that I'd done the arithmetic. He hadn't expected pushback on the number. He'd expected moral objection to the principle, which he had responses prepared for. Then Kandra moved. She was across the room before the rest of us had fully processed her intention, and she was heading for the console with the direct efficiency of someone who has identified the critical point and has one thought. Sinjin stepped into her path, and what followed was brief and very precise, and ended with Kandra on one knee and Sinjin unhurt, which was not what any of us expected. He was fast, faster than the body suggested, faster than 5 centuries in cryosuspension should have left any person. He'd been trained before his imprisonment to a level that the cold hadn't touched, and his speed was not the reflexive speed of youth, but the earned speed of someone who has done a particular kind of movement so many times that the body does it without the mind. That opened up the room. Voss shouted orders. Rill engaged 2 of the figures who materialized from the chamber's periphery, Sinjin's people, soldiers in older pattern armor who moved with competence and purpose. Fade was at the console now, moving with the focused speed of someone who had done technical intrusion into unfamiliar systems before, and knew that every system speaks the same underlying language if you know what to listen for. I was positioned between Sinjin and Kandra, which put me between Sinjin and his route back to the console. He hit me twice before I adjusted to his speed. The first landed on my forearm, which went numb for 3 seconds. The second caught my jaw and put lights in my peripheral vision. The third time he came, I moved with it instead of against it, taking the momentum and redirecting it, and I got my arm around his and used his own forward motion to put him into the wall with enough force that he needed a moment. He bounced off and came back at me, and we spent the next 30 seconds in a close exchange that I was not comfortably winning on points. He was very good. He had reach and speed and technical precision and 5 centuries of undiminished muscle memory, and on the technical merits he was possibly better than me. What he didn't have was the thing that doesn't have a good name. I've seen people fight out of ideology, out of historical grievance, out of the long-burning fury that 5 centuries in a frozen box will produce in a person, and I've seen people fight for the person standing next to them, and they are not the same fight. Ideology runs on conviction, which is a fuel that can sustain you, but eventually has a ceiling because conviction is about the idea, and the idea doesn't bleed. The other thing has no ceiling I've ever found. My ribs were screaming and my jaw was swelling and my knuckles had split, and I was still moving because Kandra was still getting to her feet behind me, and Rill was still working the flanks, and Fade needed time she didn't have yet. He knew it. I watched it register in his face, not defeat, but the specific recognition that technical superiority was not going to be sufficient against someone who had no intention of stopping regardless of the cost. He had expected rational behavior. He had modeled an opponent who would perform a calculation and conclude that continuing was not worth it. He had not modeled this. "Fade," I called out, without taking my attention off him. 20 seconds, she said. He broke off from me and tried to go around. I put my shoulder into him and drove him sideways into the console edge instead of the direction he needed. And the impact was enough to stun him for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was the margin. "Done," Fade said. The console went dark. The silence after was the kind that follows something large. Not peaceful, just the absence of the previous noise, which is a different thing entirely. Calliope had not moved during the fight. She was standing at the far end of the chamber, watching, and her expression was the most complicated thing in the room. Not grief, not anger, not surprise. Something more like a person watching a door close on a path they had chosen and accepting, without theatrics, that the choice had consequences. Voss looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You could have stopped it," he said. He wasn't being accusatory. He was stating a fact. "I could have," she agreed. "Why didn't you?" She looked across the chamber at her brother, where Rill had put a hand on Tyr's shoulder in the way soldiers do when they want to acknowledge something without finding words for it. The prince was watching his sister with the expression of someone who had been having this argument with himself for weeks and still hadn't arrived at a resolution. I wanted him to be right, Calliope said. About the compact, about what they did here. He was right about all of it, the weapon, the Quintari, the founding house's records. The history is true, every word of it. She looked at the dark console. He just wanted to burn it down when what it needs is to be opened up, brought out where people can see it. You can't undo what was done here with another weapon. You undo it by refusing to pretend it didn't happen. Kendra, back on her feet and moving carefully, looked at Calliope with the evaluating attention she gave everything on this planet. Will you testify to it? The records, the Quintari, the founding houses. Yes. Then get yourself to the ship. We moved out the way we'd come in, up through the amber corridors, back through the rising levels of the ruins complex, toward the surface and the bruise-colored light filtering down through the wrong-shaped canopy. Sinjin was restrained and moving under his own power, which he accepted with the equanimity of someone who had been imprisoned before, who knew what captivity was, and who had decided that resistance at this point was a consumption of energy better saved. He was calculating. He was always calculating. I kept that in mind. Tyr walked beside his sister with the careful silence of someone who had too many things to say and hadn't found the right shape for any of them. They walked close to each other without touching, which told me the conversation they needed to have was still ahead of them, and they both knew it. The Quintari were waiting at the ruin's edge. More than before, significantly more, I estimated 200 in sight, and the forest beyond the clearing held pressure enough to suggest more beyond the line of sight. They were not in an attack posture. They were not in any posture that I had language for. They were simply present between us and the forest in a way that had weight without having threat. The subauditory pressure was higher than anything I'd felt since we landed. I felt it in my sternum. Nobody raised a weapon. That surprised me, including about myself. The console's offline, I said, half thinking aloud. The resonance weapon isn't broadcasting anymore. They can feel that. They feel every change in the local energy signature. It's part of the pheromone network's environmental sensing. They're not moving, Rill said. No, I said. The group was still behind me. I took 3 steps forward toward the nearest Quintari. Fade's hand caught my arm. I moved her hand gently and kept walking. 12 steps, 15. I stopped 6 meters from the nearest one of the larger specimens, 6-limbed, the upper pair of limbs held loosely at its sides in a way that was different from the display posture I'd seen in the forest. The compound eyes caught no light. The mandibles were at rest. The subauditory pressure at this range was intense enough to taste, not in any physiological sense, but in the way that standing at the edge of something vast has a taste to it. I lowered my hands to my sides and left them there. The Quintari regarded me. Through it, the colony regarded me. What I said next was not eloquent. I've never been eloquent, and if you've read this far expecting eloquence, you've been patient for nothing. What I said was what I had. We shut it down. The machine that did this to your people, the weapon that changed what you are. The man who was going to use it is secured. I don't know what the compact will do when we bring back what we've found here, and I don't know what happens to this planet after. I know what was done to you, and I know it shouldn't have been done. And I know that everyone in my group is going to say that in the right rooms to the right people, because saying it is the least we can do, and doing the least we can do is still more than the last 500 years have managed. The subauditory pressure shifted. I don't have better language for it. It didn't decrease, it changed register, the way a key change doesn't reduce the volume of a piece of music but moves it to a different emotional territory entirely. Still present, still felt in the chest and behind the teeth. Different. The Quintari moved aside. Not all of them and not in the most convenient direction, but enough, a corridor through the forest, 10 meters wide, clear and direct. The ground underfoot compressed, and even in a way that suggested it had been traveled many times before. A path they had made or maintained or both. Either answer was sufficient. We walked it, all 7 of us. The Quintari held the corridor on both sides for the entire distance, and I felt their presence the whole way, not hostile, not welcoming, something beyond those categories. And by the time we reached the ship, I had filed it in the part of my mind reserved for things I don't expect to understand in this lifetime but intend not to forget. On the transit back, 2 days in jump, then the long deceleration burn into the Velhari system. Voss and I had a conversation in the aft compartment that I'd been half expecting and had not been looking forward to. He started it. He was sitting with his data pad, not reading it, and when I came back for a ration pack, he put it face down on the console without being asked. "The briefing I received," he said. "It included context about the Quintari, about what the quarantine was actually covering." I thought it might have. I was told it was classified at a level above my authorization, and I was to disregard it if it surfaced during the mission. He said it without inflection, just the statement, as though ignoring something was the same as not knowing it. I opened the ration pack, and now. Calliope has enough to testify to the founding house's records. The ruin system archived the original documentation. Fade extracted copies during the console work. We have primary source material for what was done on Durath. He paused. That's going to be very uncomfortable for a very large number of people in very comfortable positions. Yes, I said. It needs to be public. Yes, I said again. He looked at the bulkhead in the specific way of a man working through the internal arithmetic of a decision he'd already made, but hadn't yet voiced. That's going to be professionally problematic for me. It was professionally problematic for me too, I said, the first time I did it. He was quiet for a moment. Your record, he said. The incident in the Crotalis corridor. You were protecting an asset that Command had decided was too inconvenient to remain alive. She was innocent and they were going to kill her because keeping her alive required a complicated conversation with the treaty negotiators. Same as this, different scale. What happened to her after? I thought about Crotalis, about the last message I'd received from her 3 years back, routing through a civilian relay node from a location she hadn't specified, which was the smart way to do it. She's alive, I said. That's what happened to her. Voss picked up his data pad and turned it over in his hands. There was something he was moving toward, and he was being careful about the approach. The Star Force is going to want Sinjin's weapon research suppressed, he said. Not because of its history, because of its capability. A biological profile resonance weapon. The factions who would pay for that are not limited to enemies of the Compact. Then we make sure it's not only us who know about it, I said. Calliope's going to testify. Fade has the technical documentation in the sensor archive. Tyr is a prince of a protectorate, and his testimony carries institutional weight. Get it into enough independent hands and suppression becomes more expensive than disclosure. They do the math. The math works in our favor. You've navigated this before. I've managed the consequences of doing things the institutional answer would rather I hadn't done. Yes, I said. You adjust. You build a record in places they can't reach it. You find the people who will hold it. I ate a piece of the ration pack, which tasted like reconstituted regret, as it always did. You get used to not being thanked for it. He looked at me with something different from the expression he'd worn when he sat down uninvited at my table in that cantina. Something in the calibration had changed. Kandra told me, he said, that she expected to have objections to you and she doesn't. That's generous of her. From her it genuinely is. We broke out of jump 16 hours from the Velhari station, and Fade was at the nav console when I came forward, tracking something on the secondary display with the focused attention she applied to anything that moved unexpectedly. Escort waiting, she said. I looked. 4 Star Force patrol vessels, holding station at the jump point exit in a formation that was officially a welcome and functionally a demand. They had been there long enough for their positioning to settle into precision. They know we have Sinjin, Rill said from his seat. They know more than that, Fade said. The signal traffic I recorded at the edge of the jump corridor, that wasn't routine IFF. Someone had our specific jump exit coordinates before we could have transmitted them. Someone was told we were coming. Voss came forward and looked at the patrol formation for a long, still moment. Rain, he said. I'm listening. If I order you to proceed to the escort rendezvous and transfer custody as a standard recovered asset, what are you going to do? I thought about the Crotalus corridor, about the way Taylor's shields had gone dark under my burst, about the court-martial and the bill for repairs and the 8 years of freelance work in ports that didn't ask for service records, about Crotalus somewhere out in the rim, alive because one person had made one decision. I'm going to ask you if that's the order you want to give, I said. He looked at the formation. He looked at the data pad in his hand, at the documentation Fade had extracted from the ruins archive. He looked at the corridor beyond the cockpit hatch where Calliope and Tyr were sitting in a silence that had been going on for 12 hours and seemed to have more words in it than silence usually carries. No, he said, it isn't. What followed was 60 seconds of the most focused communication work I've seen from a single operator. Fade routed a burst transmission through a civilian relay node. The kind of civilian traffic that doesn't get logged by Star Force Intercept unless someone is specifically watching for it. And no one was watching for it because no one had anticipated this. The transmission reached 3 independent news services, 2 academic institutions with active xenobiology departments, a former senator whose name Voss pulled from his personal contacts with the expression of someone spending a credit they'd been holding for years, and a political journalism organization operating out of a station that was not under compact jurisdiction. The documentation package went with it, all of it, the founding house's records, the resonance weapon specifications, the Quintari biological analysis, Sinjin's compiled evidence, which was thorough to the point of obsession, because a man who has spent 5 centuries planning a reckoning does not leave gaps in his research. Then we proceeded to the rendezvous, because there was no profit in running, and because the evidence was out, and because running would have looked like guilt when the actual situation was its mirror. They held us at the station for 11 days. There were a great many people in a great many uncomfortable rooms with a great many data pads and a great deal of pointed questions. And the fact that Tyr was a royal prisoner we had recovered made the more aggressive suggestions about our legal status politically impractical in ways that the people making the suggestions understood and didn't like. Calliope testified. Voss testified. I testified twice, and was asked the same questions each time by different people hopping for a different answer. They didn't get one. The documentation circulated faster than anyone had anticipated. The xenobiology community moved with a speed and a collective outrage that I don't think the relevant parties had modeled. They had assumed scientists would take time to verify, would be cautious, would wait for institutional confirmation. What they had not counted on was a xenobiology community that had been arguing for access to Durath for 40 years, and had been told no for 40 years, and now had primary source documentation of why. They were not cautious. They were loud, and they were credible, and they were everywhere at once. By day 7, there were demonstrations on 3 stations demanding a formal inquiry, and the release of the Durath quarantine records. By day 9, the inquiry had been announced. By day 11, they let us go. Kandra delivered her verdict on the docking ring of the station where my ship was waiting, on the morning of our release. She'd been let out the same day as the rest of us, and had spent the intervening days doing things she didn't feel the need to account for, in the way of someone who has been managing their own affairs for long enough that external schedules are more advisory than binding. I don't have objections, she said. I know, I said. Voss told me. Voss talks too much. She put out her hand, which from her was the equivalent of a comprehensive endorsement, and I shook it. There's going to be a formal Quintari commission as part of the inquiry. The xenobiology people are pushing for a team that can actually land on Durath and do sustained study. They're going to need someone who knows the approach vectors and can manage the surface entry without producing a diplomatic incident. Someone will need the quarantine corridor clearance, I said. The clearance recommendation is going into the inquiry report this week. She was not quite smiling, but she was in the territory adjacent to it. I'd get the vessel licensing current if I were you. She walked back down the docking ring the way she arrived everything, with the complete self-possession of someone who has never required outside confirmation of their own direction. Fade was at my ship's boarding ramp, leaning against the hull with the patient quality she carried into everything, watching me cross the docking bay. So she said. So I said. The commission guide work if it comes together. Probably, I said. Kandra's going to want people who already know the terrain. Probably, I said. She looked at me with the same flat assessment she'd applied at our first meeting, and this time there was something else in it. Not warmth, exactly, but the particular quality of attention that takes a person seriously, which in my experience is worth more than warmth. Rill and I are between assignments, she said. I boarded my ship. I didn't tell them to find another transport. 3 hours later, when I ran the pre-launch sequence and set it for a 4-person crew configuration, nobody in the aft compartment acted surprised. Sinjin went into compact custody and stayed there, as far as I could establish. I heard from reliable sources over the following year that he was alive and talking, which told me he was being useful to someone, and that someone had decided usefulness outweighed inconvenience. What he'd told them about the resonance weapon specifications, what they were doing with that information, those were questions that the inquiry was slowly working toward and would eventually have to answer publicly. Whether the answer would be the right one depended on things that were outside my ability to control. I had put what I could into the right hands, and the rest was the long work of institutions changing, which is slow and uneven and frequently frustrating, and is still the only mechanism that produces durable results. Calliope stayed in the Velhari Protectorate. She and Tyr found their way to something that wasn't quite reconciliation and wasn't quite estrangement, the cautious middle ground of siblings who have seen each other under conditions that revealed things that can't be unrevealed. She testified twice more for the inquiry commission, and both times the documentation held up under scrutiny, because the facts were what they were regardless of who had found them and for what purpose. That's often the nature of it. The people who did the damage and the people who wanted to burn it all down are both wrong. And the truth is the residue that remains when both cases have been exhausted. The Quintari Commission got its clearance authorization 6 months after the inquiry opened its formal proceedings. I guided them in 12 scientists and 3 diplomatic mediators, and 2 security personnel who had been briefed on the subauditory pressure, and had understood the briefing, and still went pale the first time they felt it. They settled into their competence after the first 48 hours when it became clear that the Quintari were not going to attack, and had no intention of attacking, and were in fact demonstrating what the mediation team came to tentatively describe as cooperative curiosity. I spent 4 months on Durath learning the planet in a more complete way than the original mission had allowed, and what I found in the deeper chambers, and the further ruins, and the inscriptions that the researchers were beginning to decode, was a civilization that had been genuinely complex architecture that integrated biological and mechanical principles in ways the Commission's engineers couldn't yet explain. Agricultural systems that had been managing the planet's biochemistry for thousands of years, a record-keeping tradition that had apparently continued even after the weapon's pulse, even through the generations of change, even in the altered form that the colony had become. They had kept records. They had not stopped. Whether what the Quintari were now could become what they had been, no one could say. Whether they would have chosen to give up the distributed consciousness that the wound had ultimately produced, the colony mind that was both their injury and their survival, no mediator was yet positioned to ask. The language work was the long work. The pheromone network conveyed state and condition rather than proposition and argument. Building a bridge between those two modes of communication was not a matter of months or years. But the commission was there, and the commission was working, and the clearance was extended for a second cycle, which in the political vocabulary of these things means the will to continue is present. On the last night of the first commission stay, I sat outside the ship in the bruise-colored evening light of Durath's canopy, listening to the subauditory pressure that was simply always present here, the constant background hum of a colony being alive and in communication with itself, the way a forest has the constant background sound of itself existing. They'd been here for 3 generations with the machine that made them what they are, with a man who wanted to weaponize their history for his revenge, with a compact that wanted to keep both hidden beneath a quarantine designation and a bureaucratic notation about dangerous fauna. They had stayed. They had endured. They had kept their records and tended their planet and maintained, in the only form available to them, the memory of what they had been and the fact of what had been done. And when 5 humans came down into the ruins and shut the machine off and walked out with their hands open, the colony had shown us a path home. Not because we were strong enough to compel it, not because our weaponry was sufficient, not because we had made any promise the compact had taught them to trust, because we had done the one thing that the previous 5 centuries of contact had given them no expectation of. We had chosen them over the simpler answer. Fade came out of the ship and sat down beside me without asking, which I had come to understand was her way of asking. The copper smell of the forest was all around us. The subauditory pressure was in my chest and my teeth. "Ready for tomorrow," she said. "Ready enough," I said. The canopy moved in the way it always moved on Durath, with too much intention and not enough wind, with the deliberateness of a thing that had been tended for thousands of years by something that understood its own biochemistry. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the clearing, the colony continued its ancient, distributed conversation, and I sat in the middle of all that I could not name or fully understand and felt, for the first time in a long time, precisely where I was. That's the closest to a victory I've ever gotten. That's what I've learned to accept as enough.